Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Geneva Trade Week session. My name is Dmitry Grozobinski. I'm the Executive Director of the Geneva Trade Platform, and I should confess immediately that I am not a lawyer, so I am exclusively moderating this session on starting a career in trade law. We have an absolutely fantastic lineup of really experienced and senior trade law professionals from across the private sector and international organizations that I'm hoping will be able to share really actionable, practical advice for those who are contemplating a career in trade law, maybe at the start of their career and hoping to position themselves in order to do more exciting, more responsible work, or just contemplating the field and trying to decide if it's something that's right for them. As I said, this session is part of this will be the last Geneva Trade Week session that our incredible technical team is presenting themselves. And I want to express a huge thanks to them. They have been working tirelessly for 4 days, putting on sessions in every imaginable format, from early morning breakfasts to watch parties on Discord. If the last thing you hear on this stream is the popping of champagne corks, then please believe me, it is very well deserved. But for this particular session, we are talking about starting a career in trade law. And perhaps allow me to begin by introducing our wonderful panel. We have, in no particular order, Andy Scheuer, who is a partner and the co-leader of global arbitration, trade, and advocacy practice at Sidley Austin. Welcome, Andy. We also have from the private sector with us, Eugen McNamara, a partner at Aiken Gump, Strauss Hauer and Feld. I hope I've gotten that right. I'm sure I've butchered at least one of their names, but hopefully I got Eugen's right. Thank you as well for joining us. We also have Therese Vallis from the Deputy Director of the Advisory Center on WTO Law, an absolutely incredible institution here in Geneva that I'm going to ask her to explain to all of you for those who aren't familiar with its work. And with my colleague, Jan Bahanas, who is a counsel at ACWL, as well as a visiting lecturer in international law at the Graduate Institute of Geneva, where the Geneva Trade Platform is also based. So thank you very much to both of you for joining us as well. I might begin with you, Eugen, if you don't mind. And I should say, as I throw a question, I'll begin by throwing some questions to our panelists and hearing from them. But really, it's all about the questions that you have for them. You can pose those questions at absolutely any time by throwing them into the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen about there. And if you can't see it, click the 3 dots that say more next to them and it should pop up. When it gets to the Q&A, I will start picking questions off of there and throwing them to whatever panelist you ask me to, or whatever panelist I think can best bat it back to you. So please don't be shy. But as I said, I might start with you, Eugen. What is Aiken Gum for those who aren't familiar with it? How does it recruit early career professionals, and what makes it different perhaps from other law firms?
Sure. Thank you, Dimitri, and thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be able to meet the young professionals. And so, maybe I can start with just an introduction of our firm for those who are not familiar. So Aiken Gump is an international full-service law firm. We have about, I believe, over 900 lawyers and advisors located around the world. We have 18 offices around the world, and I'm based in Washington, D.C., where the majority of our international trade practice is located. But we have 11 offices throughout the United States and 7 offices internationally, including Geneva, London, as well as the Middle East and Asia. And we do have trade professional and trade practices in each of these offices. So, we have one of the largest, if not the largest, international trade practices in the United States, I believe. We have about 70 to 80 professionals in our practice. And in terms of what makes us different, I think that one of the reasons that we're so big is because we really run the full gamut of international trade sub-practices. So, for example, the areas that I specialize in are U.S. trade remedies or trade defense, as well as domestic and international trade policy, WTO advisory, and litigation. But we have other parts of our practice that focus on US and international customs law, or export control and sanctions, national security, foreign investment, antitrust, et cetera, et cetera. And these are areas where I do not specialize. And what I find really interesting about our practice is really the cross-cutting nature of our practice. So, this allows me to continue learning. It allows me to continue specializing in the areas where I specialize. But because we have so many professionals that specialize in other areas, it allows me to continue to learn and to continue to grow as a lawyer in these other areas as well by collaborating with my colleagues. And I think that in terms of service to clients as well, because we have such a broad practice, that is very well integrated both domestically and with our global offices. This allows us to issue spot in a way that isn't narrow. So if someone asks me, we'd like to know what risks we have, we'd like to know, where our vulnerabilities are, I can speak to that not just based on my area of expertise, but I can collaborate with my colleagues to find blind spots that I might not necessarily see. And so, you asked how we do early recruiting. I think, it depends a little bit. It depends on whether we're recruiting straight from law schools or if we're, recruiting laterally. It also depends a little bit on on the office. So I think that in terms of the most, common or the most typical recruiting of early professionals is through our summer associate program. And this is the program where, I think this would be the same with, I believe, Andrew's practice as well, where it is pretty common in the United States for big law firms, where we will recruit directly from the law schools for the summer associate program. The students will spend a summer in our law firm working with us and experiencing kind of the culture of the firm, the practice of the firm, and then will often be given an offer after the end of that to return as a junior associate after they graduate. So that is the typical way that we would recruit early professionals, but that's definitely not the only way. I did not go through the OCI process. For me, I came in laterally after an internship at the WTO. And for lateral hires, it's a little bit more flexible in the sense that, maybe you have certain experience that you have that might be valuable or that we might be particularly looking for. And in that case, we do hire junior professionals on a lateral basis on an as needed basis, depending on what our needs are and depending on what you can offer that we might be looking for. In our international offices, it's a little bit different just because, especially in international trade, just because our international offices tend to be a little bit more specialized. And because there isn't an OCI program in most of the on-campus program in most international offices. So for international offices, we're a little bit more flexible, a little bit more informal, and we tend to hire based on need. So it really will be, a lot of times it's, receiving applications. A lot of times it's really word of mouth where, we meet someone at a networking reception and, it seems like a good fit. They seem to have good experience and seem to, have an interest in the area that we're looking for. So really there are various channels, all with varying degrees of, difficulty or various degrees of kind of the doors being open to different degrees. But, the main message is really if you're in the United States and you're in law, but that is definitely not the only way to get into a law firm.
Thank you so much, Yujin. And I'd love to circle back to you in a little bit to talk about some of the things that Akin Gump looks for, given the breadth of its practice. But before we do that, I might go to you, Andy. You've heard Yujin describe Akin Gump and some of the things that make them unique. Just for the sake of contrast, I suppose, where does Sidley kind of differ from that? And what are the kind of things they might be doing early on in their career at Sidley?
Sure. Thank you, Dimitri, and thank you again to everyone for the opportunity to participate again this year. Sidley is very similar in a large full-service law firm with offices in the United States, in Europe, and in Asia Pacific. It's a larger law firm, more than twice as large as Aiken Gump. We have over 2,000 lawyers, but very similar in terms of the footprint. And I think for particularly students outside the United States, one of the best ways to think about large law firms, big law, as is often called here in the States, is in really three buckets: litigation, sort of contentious matters, corporate work, transactional matters, and then the regulatory work. And so that, I think, is similar across most of the large law firms. Just as Eugen described, we have also an integrated practice where we have trade lawyers here in the US, in Europe, as well as in Asia. I think, Dimitri, the distinguishing feature is that, as in our rather difficult to pronounce name, GATA, the Global Arbitration, Trade, and Advocacy, our practice is integrated as between arbitration and trade. I think, to risk using an overused word, I think that is unique in the practice. That is, we are not siloed or separated as between those who practice international commercial arbitration and treaty-based arbitration and the international trade practice. This is a historical feature. Really the founder of our practice as it stands now, my former colleague Dan Price, whom I worked with at the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, that was his experience and his vision. So we've carried that over more than 20 years later here at Sidley. And what it does is, just as Eugen described, we're issue spotting, but I think we are agnostic with respect to the treaty base of the solution to a problem. So where yesterday I was talking to one of my colleagues, we were discussing a problem that a client, which is a global company, was having with respect to some regulatory issues in China and some concerns. And so we look both at whether there are trade solutions as well as investment treaty solutions that could be brought through investor state dispute settlement. And that's a feature of our practice, and it has carried forward. So we're often using all of those tools, as well as all of the trade tools that Eugen described. So it's very similar in that respect, but I think that is a distinguishing factor. And it simply means that younger lawyers have to expect to be open to do all of those things. So to doing the contentious matters that might arise not only in international commercial arbitration or treaty arbitration, as well as trade disputes. We're working right now on a trade dispute under the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, and as well as a investment dispute. So that's very common here in the US, and then integrate with the economic sanctions export controls practitioners within our Brussels office and in our London office. And so I think, again, Dimitri, younger lawyers would expect, if they came to us, to have that sort of range of activity. And so that's really the distinguishing factor.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Thank you, Andy. I think a good overview of what young people can expect if they make it into Sidley. I will certainly circle back to you to pick your brain as well for sort of practical advice for people hoping to get into Sidley or a law firm like it. But before I do, I might turn to Cherise. ACWL is not a law firm in the traditional sense, but you do some of the most exciting trade work out there. I wonder if you could first begin by kind of sharing a little bit about what ACWL is and what it does, and what your staff are up to.
Great. Thank you very much, Dimitri. Thanks for the invitation. I'm always happy to talk about the ACWL. So this is a great opportunity. The Advisory Center on WTO Law is an international organization. We are based only in Geneva. We have only one office, and we are quite a small organization. We have 12 lawyers. But despite our small size, we cover a lot of ground. So first, let me tell you why the ACWL was created and what it is that we do. So we were created in 2001, and the purpose of the ACWL was to enable developing countries and least developed countries to engage fully in the WTO system. And it was really to provide them with the legal capacity to engage and to bring and defend disputes. So unlike, USTR or the European Commission or whatever, or the Canadian Trade Law Bureau, most developing countries don't have a lot of in-house expertise. And they also don't have they don't always have the financial resources to hire law firms like Sidley or Aiken Gump. And so we were created really to be their in-house departments, legal departments. And right now we have 39 developing countries and 43 least developed countries that are entitled to receive our services. So that comes to 82 countries, which is basically 1/2 of the membership of the WTO. So those are a lot of countries to serve. And what we do for those countries is basically 3 types of services. So we provide legal opinions, and we provide legal opinions on issues such as the members' own measures. Like countries will come to us and say, look, we're thinking of passing this law. Can you tell us if it's WTO consistent? And if not, how should we remedy it to make it WTO consistent? So that's one kind of legal opinion we provide. We also provide opinions on other members' measures. So this is usually a precursor to, dispute, bringing a dispute. And then we get a lot of requests for just institutional questions like, what are these rules of procedure for this committee or the council? When can I raise this matter? How do I raise it? Those kinds of questions. So that's what we do in terms of legal opinions. And we deliver about 200 plus legal opinions per year. So, and that is both to developing countries and to least developed countries. Now, the second thing we do, and this is something that we have in common with the law firms, is we engage in dispute settlement activities. So we represent WTO members at all levels of dispute settlement. So from consultations, we will go to the consultations, panel, appellate body, when there was an appellate body, compliance, retaliation. So we've done the whole gambit. And that has been very exciting, I think, for all of the lawyers here at the ACWL. We did a review, and we counted up all the numbers, and we found that, if the ACWL were a country, we would be the 4th largest participant after the EU, the US, and China. So we have been involved in 70 disputes since 2001. And the third type of service that we provide is training. So we do an annual training course. We teach once a week. It's the lawyers that teach. So we really draw upon our litigation experience when we teach. We have about 44 delegates come to our office every week. And that's been really great. We all teach the courses. So I think that the most important thing is that we are like a law firm, but we are also like a university, and we do whatever we can to developing countries and least developed countries. One other thing that differs us from law.
I might turn to you, Jan. Teresa's already spoken about ACWL, but kind of looking at your career bio, you have done almost everything it is possible to do in international trade law. You've worked at WTO Secretariat, you've worked at Sidley Austin, I believe, for a time. You worked, you now at ACWL, and you lecture as well, and you teach. So just in addition to contributing to, I think, some books and academic writing, so you've really kind of done it all when it comes to working in this field. So I might put you on the spot a little bit and just ask, what is your pitch to people considering this world of trade law? It's obviously got something for you because you've stuck around and you've tried all of its aspects. What's magical about trade law?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Nidimi, for inviting me to be here, and it's a particular pleasure to be on this panel with my former boss, Andy, at Sidley, and my current boss, Sherry. So this is an extra pleasure. I was going to perhaps share the kind of advice that I give to the students who come to me for advice, who already know that they want to go into the international trade law world, and the kind of advice that I give them based on what I have seen over the years successful students do. But you started out on a slightly different note. What is the allure of international trade law? I think what is so fascinating about it is that it's a genuinely interdisciplinary world. It offers, it's obviously a legal field, but it brings together economics, it brings together politics, it's genuinely global. When you work in that field, whether it is in one of the leading law firms like Akin Gump or Sidley, or whether it's in a government or in the WTO itself or in the advisory center, you really have to have a genuinely global perspective. And another thing that I believe in, that I think is something that I see with all trade law professionals, whether it's here in Geneva or in Brussels or in DC, is that it's a genuine community of values. I think it's people might differ in their perspectives on some of the nitty-gritty or technicalities about how trade policy should be conducted, but I think there is a underlying consensus about values, about global cooperation, and the genuine contribution that these domestic, regional, and global trade institutions make for a better world. And perhaps the sound has a little bit of a sound of pathos to it, but I genuinely believe in it. And so I think this sort of interdisciplinarity, coupled with these values, and of course a community of fantastic professionals with incredible professional acumen and experience and abilities and skills, it's what really makes this a fascinating and very rewarding world. So that's how I would pitch the international trade world. Maybe I can save my comments for later so that I don't speak for too long.
We will absolutely circle back to you for your advice. I wanted to give everyone a chance to introduce themselves, and I thought that pitch was fantastic. I'm watching the attendees count, and we didn't lose anyone midway through that pitch, so you were at least compelling enough to keep them here, and I think a lot more so. But assuming that Jan has managed to sell you on a career, either continuing or starting a career in trade law, how do you go about it, and what you should be doing, which is really the heart of this session. And I might start back with you, Eugen. I think there's a lot of change going on right now, and I think anybody who's entering a career might be looking to set themselves up with skills to get the job, but also to thrive in the job. What are the kind of skills that you think law firms are looking for today and will be looking forward for in the future?
Sure. I'm mindful that we're talking about early career professionals, and I think that especially for early career professionals coming into the area of international trade law, you're right that there's a lot of changes that are going on. But I don't think that my answer to that would differ no matter when you ask me, because I think that really the core skill set of good writing and having an interest, that to me continues to be the most important factors. If you have some background expertise in a particular area, or even just background interest in a specific area of trade, such as whether it's trade remedies, whether it's China issues, whether it's national security, those can all be pluses that are timely. But I don't think that we necessarily expect our junior associates or junior professionals coming in to have that knowledge. What we do, because those are all teachable. Those are all things that, that we can train on. The things that are more difficult are things like core skills like writing. If you don't have good writing, that's really hard to fix. That takes a lot of time to fix. So, one of the core things that at least I'm always looking for is, are you a good writer? Are you a clear writer? And the other thing I think would be really interest. One of the things that I think that this goes a little bit to, the allure of international trade that Jan was talking about, in the sense that for me, one of the things that I love about this practice is my colleagues, and the fact that I don't think anybody just happens on trade law. No one just, graduates and somehow finds themselves in trade law. Every one of us that end up in trade law are here because we had an interest in it and because we specifically sought it out. And I think that because of that, the colleagues that I work with and the professionals that I interact with in the community all tend to be very, very passionate about the work that they do, and tend to have a genuine interest. It's not just a job, it's not just a career, it's something that we all have a genuine, very strong interest and passion for. So those are the things that I tend to look for when I look at whether it's interviewees or just even in networking sessions where I'm talking to people, is really how interested are you, how curious are you, and what is your hunger for developing the skills, the specific skills that you need to succeed.
It's fascinating how much that resonates. We had a session 2 hours ago on sort of general career and trade advice, and we had George Riddell, who's the Director of Trade Strategy for Ernst & Young in London, and those were effectively the first 2 points that he rattled off when he's hiring for a policy practice. This notion of passion and this notion of ability to communicate and write well were sort of top of his list as well, even though his field is, okay, it's still trade, but it's vastly different from trade law. And actually thinking back, I think it's what governments were hiring as well when they were looking at us. When they were hiring us for diplomatic jobs, they weren't thinking, are you the best Middle East analyst in the world at the age of 21? They were saying, are you passionate about this? Can you write well? And will your colleagues want to strangle you after a week? Which is all of the 3 points that you raised. It's amazing how horizontal this advice is. To stay on that theme of advice, which will be continuing all the way through, Andy, if I could take you back a little bit, if knowing what you know today, you were giving yourself career advice at age 20, what would be some of the key pieces of advice you think you'd offer younger Andy?
One is kind of embrace the quantitative side. All of what we do is the application of law to economics. Eugen in the trade remedies space is, so I think what I mean to say is try to get comfortable and don't fear it. And I think I was lucky. I studied economics undergraduate, but I think the understanding not only of the economic tools, but also business and the business world is critical. I see younger lawyers come and with all the skills and the passion as Eugen described, but sometimes I think that they don't have a good sense or didn't educate themselves on really business organizations and how business works. And that has been for me throughout my career, the ability to understand business organizations and how they interact is as important as my ability to take provisions from the WTO agreements and apply them to facts. So that's great. In some sense, then it really is embracing the other change. And Dimitri, I think that's something that has come through some of the other sessions. I'm entering my 13, lots of changes over the years. Even the experience in a domestic litigation context where I worked on writing, I'm still learning, but I think those are the things that I probably would have advised myself to get smarter on early.
I wonder if I could ask a follow-up on the first part of that question regarding of that answer regarding sort of business acumen, understanding the corporate world, understanding economics. If it's something you value, it sounds like likely something that you and others would be looking for in a candidate as well. What are the kind of things someone could have on a resume, or what are the kind of anecdotes someone could bring to an interview that would demonstrate to you that they have made at least some effort to understand this world?
Dimitri, one obvious example that I'm thinking of is I have a colleague who's now my partner in our practice. She came before she was in law school. She worked in-house in a non-legal compliance position. So she was doing the export control and economic sanctions work in-house. She has an extraordinary understanding of how companies work, and that has, I think, really stood her in good stead. It really is that kind of that knowledge of internal bureaucracy, which is hard to learn from the outside. In a way, when I joined USTR from a law firm, one of the things that I didn't have was how the interagency practice worked. And it took me a long time to figure out how to be effective with other agencies. So in that sense, that's something that that is a great skill set to have, and I look for on a resume.
So it sounds like in part the advice there would be that if you have had any roles within a regulatory setting, for example, within even local government, even if they're not directly relevant to, if they weren't directly law jobs, even the ability to say, listen, I've functioned inside of a large bureaucracy, I've functioned inside working with regulators, working in a large corporate space, I know how this works, is really the real takeaway, and not to hide that at the back of your resume because you don't think it's pure law. Absolutely. I might turn to sort of on this notion of being inside organizations. I'll turn this to Charisse for a moment. The ACWL has this incredible secondment program where you're constantly playing host to these incredible sort of young, I would say early to early mid-career legal professionals from really all over the world. Were there particular skills that they brought to the table or experiences that they had that really impressed you that maybe some of the people watching this could emphasize if they happen to have them, or seek out similar sort of proof of talent?
Thanks, Dimitri. Well, as many of you might know, we have a secondment program whereby government lawyers from our developing country members and least developed countries can join the ACWL for 9 months. They usually start in October and it goes to June of the following year. And when they are here, we treat them as staff members. They're just, we bring them to meetings, we bring them to WTO dispute settlement proceedings, etc. And we really try and integrate them into the ACWL. To date, we've had 54 lawyers join us. There have been 35 women and 19 men. And we're actually getting our new bunch of participants on Monday. Now, they do, as you say, come from very diverse backgrounds. So we have civil lawyers, common lawyers, lawyers from African countries, Asian countries, Latin American countries, etc. And I think what one skill that they all have in common is to, I guess, promote themselves, to engage us with them to I mean, it is clear that they have to have good research and, good writing skills, etc. That is, a given. But I would draw the a distinction between two parts of the process. One is the application process, and the second is their actual work with us. In the application process, it is critical to really promote yourself in that cover letter and in your, what we have is an application form, much like the WTO. And in your cover letter, you really have to emphasize those aspects of your background that would be of interest to the company or the organization that you are applying to. And it really, I mean, I think one of the most effective cover letters I've ever seen was from somebody who said, I've just graduated from, my LLM. I have no work experience, but I would like to join the ACWL. And so how do I convince you that I am a suitable candidate to be interviewed? And then they said, here are 3 reasons why. One, I'm incredibly hardworking. I have attention to detail. And an example of that was when I worked on X, in a summer job, and then 2 and 3 sort of reasons why they thought that they would be a good person to interview. And I was so impressed when I read that cover letter. We did interview this person, and this person is now a lawyer at the ACWL. So it is just important to personalize your application and to, really try and stand out while highlighting your, positive qualities. Second is when you are actually working at a job. And I think it is so important, and the seconded lawyers do this on a regular basis. They, we give them an assignment, they do the work, we give them guidance, and then they will come back to us afterwards and say, can you tell me what it is that that I did wrong, what I should have, done better, how I could have improved it, etc. And we think it's very important to give them that feedback. So the skills that they bring are, of course, their educational background, their ability to do research, their ability to write well, and those are all incredibly important to help them fit in and work together with us at the ACWL.
Thank you so much, Race. What I thought was especially interesting there was when you were describing how they seek out feedback. The fact that they do it post factum is really interesting. So I think a lot of people naturally will solicit feedback as they're putting together a piece of work to get it to the point where it's, say, satisfactory for a supervisor, and sort of say, how do I fix this in order to get this done? Or is this okay? But the fact that they're actively coming back to you and saying, okay, it's done now, it is out of my life, but actually I want to revisit it because I want to see what I can learn from a project I've already delivered. I think that's really, really interesting. And certainly something that, in our own staff, we would love to see. I might then come back to Jan, who I know you're bursting to provide advice, and I cruelly sabotaged you earlier by making you pitch the entire legal profession to the audience. But I know you work with students all of the time. You mentor students, you give students advice at this stage of their career. So I wonder if you could share some of the nuggets of wisdom that you dispense from your office at the Graduate Institute.
With pleasure, Dmitry. And by the way, it was a great question. Your first question, you caught me a little bit off guard, but it's great to actually pause and think, why is it that I love being in trade so much? So it was really, really good. So here are sort of the key points of advice that I tell students, and it's a specific group of students that I mostly speak to, they are either considering enrolling in a trade program, either specialized program or a institution like the Graduate Institute, or already enrolled, and who know that they would like to get their foot in the door in the international trade world. So the first piece of advice to give is really just be or become a good international trade lawyer, know your trade stuff, take all the right courses, choose a trade topic for your thesis if you have a thesis to write. Do things like the WTO law moot court. Some of the most successful, students who found great jobs in the trade law field after their studies have done the WTO law moot court. It's a great practice for litigation. Attend trade-related events, read trade blogs, listen to trade podcasts. What Andy said before really resonated with me. Take also a few quantitative courses. I'm personally grateful for every single quantitative course that I took during my studies, whether it's stats, whether it's econometrics, economics. It's really helpful because of the multidisciplinary nature of the field that I mentioned before. I would also echo what Eugene said is, if English is not your first language, make sure your English is really impeccable, both your spoken English as well as your written English. And the other piece of advice that I would highlight, and that might sound obvious given the speakers we have on this panel, but sometimes it's less obvious to the students who perhaps are studying at the Graduate Institute, or say at the Mile in Bern, or at Yelpo in Barcelona, and who are very much focused on sort of the Geneva trade world, the WTO and the law firm offices in Geneva. Really think big of the amazing trade law opportunities out there outside of Geneva. I mean, Geneva is great, but think of all the amazing, fascinating work that people like Andy and Eugene do. The work that Cherise and I do is obviously also very interesting, and we both love it. But it's fascinating to hear the amazing things that Andy and Eugene do. Things like domestic international trade law, whether it's trade remedy, customs work, export controls, regional dispute settlement, the work with corporate clients, the private-public partnerships that are, such an integral part of the international trade law world. So think of the capitals, think of the work opportunities that your governments offer you as government officials. Think of the amazing career paths that law firms like Sidley Austin or Aiken Gump offer. So really think beyond the Geneva horizon. And you can obviously always transition into the Geneva world later if you wish, but you will have built up an amazing skill set and experiences that you wouldn't necessarily get in Geneva.
Some fantastic advice there. If I could throw one in on that sort of get good at quant advice, I would also add get at least very good to expert in just Microsoft Word and Excel. I don't know how much of my career I owe to being the one guy within walking distance of my boss's office who could make the table line upright, or who could add up make the Excel do the thing. But early on in your career, are you going to have the one piece of legal advice your partner's never heard before? Maybe not every day, but if you can bring other skills to the table, that's a great way to get noticed and then immediately have value add on day one, rather than at the end of that process. I'd love to throw it over to Q&A now, and please do bombard us with questions using that Q&A box about there on your screen. We've got one question that I think actually is probably best for Andy. It actually asks both of us that we've both talked about the importance of earlier experiences in government and how it can be useful to show in a CV. But the question is, aren't government jobs so bureaucratic and so different from how law firms are organized that it wouldn't have a lot of relevance? Now, you've actually done both. You've been in USTR, in government, and in law firms. Andy, if you want to tackle it.
I'm thinking about that question. I think that it's maybe bureaucratic in a different way. I guess what I was discussing is, let's say you're working for a large company and you're in an analytical space, you're in a compliance space. whatever role you're playing, there are, you're dealing with fiefdoms, you're dealing with kind of inefficiencies in communications. Those are the kinds of things that we see often in government as well. And I guess if you survive that and if you thrive, then those are skills that are, I think, extremely useful, because in the law firm, what you're trying to do is not just, and maybe to follow on Dimitri's comment, it's great if you have the piece of legal advice that your client has not heard before. That's what you're getting paid for. But can you deliver it in a way that is going to be received and useful? Do you understand where your client is and how they need to play that with their bosses, with other parts of the company? That part of being in a corporate law setting, I think, is extremely valuable. So it were those insights that I thought one could derive from having experience.
And if I can just jump in and add to that, so, and as someone that has not worked in the government, for me, it's really, understanding, earlier, Andrew talked about the interagency process. Those are things that I don't have insight into because I've never been there. So to have team members that actually understand how government works, especially because a lot of the work that we do is government facing, in terms of, international trade in the United States. As Jan said, a lot of it is domestic, a lot of it isn't WTO, and a lot of the work that we do is interfacing with the US government. So a lot of times we say that, when we say international trade, a lot of it is actually domestic regulatory. It's not actually, the thing that's international about it a lot of times is the parties that are involved. So understanding what goes on inside the government is so valuable. And also, as someone that hasn't worked at the government, one of the great values that I see in my colleagues that have worked in the government is really the connections that they have. My interface with the government will usually be, as someone that is coming to the government as a lawyer, for an outside lawyer. But a lot of the colleagues that have spent years in the government have, genuine relationships with government officials. And that tends to be very, very valuable.
I'd like to jump in as well, Dimitri. I worked for the Canadian government and the Trade Law Bureau when I was with the Foreign Service. And I must say that experience has been invaluable for me in advising governments on a daily basis at the ACWL. Knowing how governments work, what you can propose to a government, sort of the parameters of what is doable and what is not doable. That there needs to be a lot of intergovernmental coordination, that there's going to be rivalries and, turf wars and all of that. And so you have to build all of that into your process of preparing as a lawyer, let's say in a dispute. You can't expect everything to be perfect on day one, and it's a process. And I think my experience in government taught me very clearly that a lot of the, negotiations are really internal government negotiations rather than fighting with the other country. So I think it may be bureaucratic. In some sense everything is a bit bureaucratic, but nevertheless that substantive experience, that procedural knowledge that working for your government gives you, I think is invaluable if you, wish to advise governments or represent governments in the future.
And I think those are fantastic answers. And I think all of those things are things that you should consider. If you do happen to have government experience or large corporate experience, those are the kind of things that you would want to perhaps think about including in your answers during an interview, as sort of as sub-points in your resume, as things that you would be able to bring to the table to just highlight that you have those skills. Really just understanding the difference between how things should work on paper and how they actually work once the rubber of law meets the road of people and government is fantastically useful. We have another, I think, fantastic question here, which is, it's from someone who's already working in trade law as a public servant in a developing country, but they're looking to work internationally. And they're asking a question that I think echoes, especially around Geneva, but I suspect around Brussels and DC and many other places, which is, are the jobs that are posted online, is it worth applying for jobs that are posted online, given that there are huge competition? And to be very frank, sometimes, at least in Geneva, the jobs that you see online may have already have a candidate in mind before the position is even posted. So we haven't heard from Jan for a while, and you have a very diverse CV and you talk to students all the time. So perhaps we could start with you, but anyone else is free to jump in as well.
Well, it's a great question. I think I would say that there is definitely an opportunity for candidates, even if they don't have a degree from a top school, and that perhaps goes back to what I was saying before. I mean, if you have very specific experience, for instance, working in the government, if you already have a couple of years under your belt and you have, say, government experience, the right kind of experience that perhaps a law firm may be looking for, or an institution like the ACWL or the WTO. If, for instance, you're applying to the WTO Secretariat for a position in, and I'm just going to give a random example here, for the Rules Division, I think the Rules Division will look whether you have experience working with trade remedies. So if you have worked in a domestic investigating authority or otherwise in a customs administration, or perhaps if you've been in private practice representing clients in trade remedy proceedings, I think that will be perhaps just as much, if not more important, in terms of a factor in the hiring process than would be the name of the school from which you graduated. So I think, especially if we're not speaking necessarily about entry-level positions, but for more advanced professionals, I think the right kind of experience could be even more important and very, very valuable.
Joyce, I wonder if I could bring you in here, because something that I was thinking about as Jan was answering is that sometimes in a developing country context, at least in diplomacy, because of the nature of developing country ministries that tend to be less well resourced than, say, the US, you will have experiences earlier on in your career that put you head and shoulders above some of the people that you'd be competing with from developed countries, just because they're in ministries with a lot more staff. And so if you're from a developing country, you may have gotten to do things and be in senior rooms much, much earlier. I know you kind of work with people from developing countries all of the time, and lawyers. Is that, am I on the right track?
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. I think that sometimes when you are at a, in a small developing country, that you are, the chief cook and bottle washer all at the same time. So maybe you have more experience in that area. But I just wanted to go back to the point that was raised in the question, which I think was, is it worthwhile to apply for these online jobs, or do people already have somebody in mind and they're just going through the process? For the ACWL, we have only advertised for positions that we really want to get fresh CVs for. We would not waste people's time by having somebody in mind and then putting out a vacancy on our website and getting people's hopes up and just having them go through the time and the preparation, etc., and then already have somebody in mind. So I would think that other organizations may follow the same approach, but I think it is really important because people invest a lot when they make an application for a job. Especially at the ACWL, we also have a written exam, and so people will prepare for that to a great extent, and so it really would be so upsetting, I think, to have people go through all of that and then say, oh, by the way, I already had somebody in mind. So that's not something that we do here.
Thank you, Charisse. Andy, Eugen, did you have any thoughts on sort of the merits of applying for international jobs? Sort of just generally the cost benefit analysis of applying widely?
I think that it's, again, it does take a lot of effort. Most law firm jobs generally don't require an exam, although I think, Jan, we used to require an exam in Geneva. I don't know whether, but we don't do it it's not really the style to do in the States, so it's really an application. So, I mean, I would encourage people to apply to a job that is promising. Yes, it's possible that there's an inside candidate. But I think, as Charisse says, even when that happens, institutions, they need talent. I mean, law firms, we exist only to the extent that we can deliver that talent in the form of excellent legal advice. So I think using those opportunities are worthwhile. I cannot discount the fact that sometimes there is an inside candidate, but I would hope that kind of quality would out simply because it's market driven.
And I would agree with that. I mean, it's true that sometimes there is an inside candidate, but a lot of times we have had openings where we're genuinely just really desperate to find someone, and either people don't apply, whether it's because they think that it's just the position that's been posted for that reason, or just because someone doesn't actually have the specific expertise that we're looking for. So there are often a lot of times where we genuinely are looking for people. I think that from a U.S. law firm perspective, in terms of international applications, we are generally looking for someone that has a U.S. that can practice, that is certified to practice in the United States, or at least would be able to. I think that is not the case in our international offices, where you can be barred in any jurisdiction. And so in that respect, for example, our Geneva office would probably be a better fit for someone that is not licensed to practice law in the US. Whereas, even if you're located in a different country, if you do have a US law license, then, it would be worth applying to our US office.
And I think certainly the same would be true if you're applying for an international organization in Geneva, for example. The WTO doesn't need you to be barred in any one particular jurisdiction. I think I'm seeing nods from the actual lawyers on the call. So hopefully I'm not too far out on that. Well, that actually brings us to the end of our hour. Thank you so much to all four of our panelists, to Andy, to Eugen, to Charisse, and to Jean. I think there were some genuinely insightful and hopefully useful tips for our viewers and our listeners, for everybody who's contemplating trade law that Jan sold so well. So thank you very much for taking the time. This has been a Geneva Trade Week session. And as always, we want to say a big thank you to the technical team that made it possible, as well as to the Australian government, the Geneva Chamber of Commerce, and the Graduate Institute that makes Geneva Trade Week possible. We will, of course, put this video up online so that if you only missed part of it, you can watch it back. But for now, it is my duty to say thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you next time.